in the Center for the Study in Regional Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And
your name?
I'm B.S. Butola. I'm one of the very few person who is now outside the formal system who has started Chipko movement. Let me just tell you that people, those who are at the moment champion of Chipko, they are never Chipkos. Neither Bhagwan nor Chandra. They were all forest contractors. And they are doing their own business. But what actually happened that I was very young at that point of time, thrown out of my house, being a political activist, came to JLU. I spent my lot of time in the Northeast. I had 16 years, and virtually I am also an extensive traveler. There is hardly any district of India before 2005. Now I really new districts coming up. I have visited every district that way and tried to understand the whole mechanism of India. And I realized that what is the difference between the Western universalism and in India is that the crux of Western universalism is basically the process of othering. And that's why Hegel says that the essence of human being lies in other-drivenness. I am not I, myself. I am myself. I am how you recognize. Therefore, there is always a struggle going on for othering. While in Indian philosophy, it is not the process of othering that is important, it is about being actually. One has to really integrate what is my being. And this being is in search of exaltation. What actually happened when the process of othering has encountered the process of being? Now what Rajiv said, the whole process of digestion. What actually happened that the process of othering at the moment seemed to be dominant or dominating because of various reasons. One of the reasons is that because of the materiality of it, the realization. And in the process of realization, West is powerful because they were the one who had colonized. There is something objective out there. For example, India is not the map that we study on the wall. India is basically the way we psychologically internalize it. But since the British had first map of India, therefore they are the one who had the authenticity. Because we don't have it. And as a result of that, they became knowledgeable. They became the exponent and authentic. While we did not, put it that way. And in the process of othering, there is history, in the evening, I will get more. What actually happened today is that it is the life that is the other. And how life is really being used, I have used 4 tools of it, what is called political technologies. One is the time. I read Rabindranath Tagore's article, The Time is a Metaphor in History. She is a nice lady, very pedantic learner, but I think very weak in the philosophical traditions of India. Time is not a metaphor, time is a tool. Time is power. How through time you construct the other. And basically what actually happening today is that the clocks, I can give you an example. When the French Revolution did take place, the Republicans asked one very important question. Why January is January, why February is February, August is August? Why Monday is Monday, why Tuesday is Tuesday? Isn't it that by saying August and September we are heroing the Greek dictator or the Roman dictators? We are remembering them. The best thing that we can do is January or maybe August, September or July. The Roman and Greek dictators are being remembered. What are the Sunday, Monday? It's basically nothing but again Greek god and goddesses. The whole Greek concept of the universe or whatever is there. Therefore what they said, listen. Second thing is that, why February should have 28 days, 29 days? Because Julius Caesar and Octavius took one away from that to immortalize themselves. If I am born, then my birth cannot be ordinary birth. It has to be 31 days, not like this. And therefore what actually happened is that they said, listen, this is basically how West is trying to construct the world. That's what they said. Why a clock should have 24 hours? He said, listen, a month should have 30 days. A day of 10 hours. And why beginning should be January, 31st December, January? The reason is that by that inadvertently we know the Christ. Oh yes, 25th December Christ. He said, no, 22nd of September is the right time. Because day and night are equal. And therefore, That is what I'm quoting you. Today what actually happening is that this time construction has taken place at the biology. What is green revolution? Green revolution is nothing but disturbing the biological clock of different organisms. In Kerala, the coconut used to grow after 10 or 11 years. Today, a coconut tree is able to yield fruits in 1.5 years. All of take the broilers. What is broiler? It's a chicken which can be ready for 1 and 2 kg in 6 months' time. What are the raw fish that come from Andhra Pradesh? What actually happening is the biological clock of that is being tampered. The vegetable that you eat. And this is where the process of othering, and where life itself is being othered actually. Our life is a colony. And it is there the time is being used. The second that I'm really working on is that the census. Census is not the counting of the people, please don't. That is an infinitesimal aspect. Census is construction of the people. It's construction. Let me give an example. There are gender categories in census, male and female. What about those who are neither male nor female? And unfortunately, the people, those who want to be included in female, they are put in male category. All the units, you ask them, I asked them, nearly 500, they want to put in the female category, but census put them in male category. This is how rural and urban, in India, there is no definition of a rural. What is not urban is rural, and nobody doesn't know. In India, unlike the West, we have one definition of rural, urban. In India, there are 7 different types of urban centers as on today. And they are diametrically opposite. Haridwar is an urban center. The town that I come from, Badrinath, is urban by default. It is only 40 population. 40 people, permanent residents of Badrinath, are urban. Why Gavargaon in Ghazipur has more than 1,60,000 people? They are rural. Now the question is that is how it constructs the urban. The second aspect that I am talking of is the geo-bodies. That I am talking. Today what actually happening is that the West has defined nation, this type of this, this type of that. No, please. Indian concept of nation is that a geo-body. In India, again rural. There are census villages, there are revenue villages, there are panchayat raj villages, but there are also village deity villages. And every village has a deity. And therefore, today, what is happening to Narega? Narega is basically a very powerful tool that the system is using. You bring liquidity to rural areas, make agricultural useless. If you get 100 rupees daily employment without doing anything, and rice at 2 rupees a kg, why should you work in agriculture? Therefore, land becomes like you sell it. And as a result of that, selling land is also you sell a part of yourself. Because that is a geo-body of every village. The village. Earlier a person from Bihar, we went as far as Trinidad and Tobago. The lady came and cried at the Delhi airport. The lady, the Visheshwar, Kamala Visheshwar. She said, I remember that my ancestors used to talk of the village. And you know what happened? Earlier generations of Indians, they used to go to England and Canada and Australia. And the last time they used to sell the land, a part of the soil from the house they used to take and they used to preserve in their greatest treasure. Today, we are ready. Villages have become a liability to us. Because the Western census construction of village has gone into this is an analytical kind of thing. And in this case, the fourth component that I really looking at the whole concept of how the whole process of the othering in the West has come in the concept of the education itself. The whole
we'll come back to the round of this.
This education system actually, the Western education makes us obsolete and redundant. And that is where we think we are educated. The more obsolete you become, the more redundant you become, the more qualified I feel myself. And that is where I am really looking on the whole aspect of the politics of life.
नमस्कार, मैं संतोष कुमार शुक्ल जेएनयू में संस्कृत पढ़ाता हूँ और आज के इस कार्यक्रम में भारतीय ज्ञान परंपरा को शिक्षा में कैसे लाया जाए, जो भारतीय शिक्षा व्यवस्था है उसमें कैसे लाया जाए, और उसमें भी मुख्य रूप से हम केवल सोशल साइंसेज में सोच रहे हैं अभी तत्काल में कि सोशल साइंसेज में इसको कैसे भारतीय ज्ञान परंपरा को जोड़ा जाए। यद्यपि कोलंबिया विश्वविद्यालय में डेथ ऑफ संस्कृत प्रोजेक्ट चल रहा है। मतलब डेथ ऑफ संस्कृत प्रोजेक्ट का मतलब है डेथ ऑफ इंडियन नॉलेज सिस्टम। लेकिन हम तो उस बात को नहीं मानते हैं कि ये परंपरा मर चुकी है, खत्म हो चुकी है, क्योंकि उनका कहना है कि अब इस भाषा में ये कार्य लेखन पठन बंद हो चुका है, इसलिए ये ट्रेडिशन खत्म हो चुका है। और हम लोग भी अंग्रेजी में ही ये सब बातें लिख करके उन्हीं की परंपरा को और आगे बढ़ाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं। बात 1947 में शुरू नहीं हुआ कि संस्कृत एजुकेशन सिस्टम में इंडियन नॉलेज सिस्टम को नहीं जोड़ा गया। ये बात 1947 से नहीं शुरू हुई। ये बात शुरू हुई राजा राम मोहन राय और सर विलियम जोन्स की जो लड़ाई हुई कि भारत में शिक्षा व्यवस्था कैसी होनी चाहिए, और सर विलियम जोन्स इस बात के पक्षधर थे कि जो भारत की ज्ञान परंपरा है इसको शिक्षा व्यवस्था में रखा जाए। लेकिन राजा राम मोहन राय जैसे भारतीय चिंतकों ने उसका जबरदस्त विरोध किया और उसको आने नहीं दिया। और इसको थोड़ा दूर करने के लिए बीच में दो प्रयास किए गए। 1916 के आसपास वो एनी बेसेंट और मदन मोहन मालवीय जी ने प्रयास किया कि भारतीय शिक्षा व्यवस्था में परिवर्तन करके और दोनों को जोड़ा जाए। केवल भारतीय ही नहीं, प्रतीची और प्राची, ईस्ट और वेस्ट को दोनों को जोड़ करके एक ऐसा एजुकेशन सिस्टम बनाया जाए। 1915 से लेकर 1922 तक ये बात हुई। लेकिन 1947 के बाद जब स्वतंत्रता हुई तो स्वतंत्रता के बाद जितने भी एजुकेशन के कमीशन बने, चाहे स्कूली शिक्षा के या विश्वविद्यालय शिक्षा के, विश्वविद्यालय अनुदान आयोग, सर्वपल्ली राधाकृष्णन कमीशन के रिपोर्ट के आधार पर यूनिवर्सिटी ग्रांट कमीशन बना और एक विश्वविद्यालय व्यवस्था बनाई गई। किसी भी कमीशन ने आज तक, भारतीय कमीशन ने ये चिंता ही नहीं प्रकट की कि भारतीय ज्ञान परंपरा को शिक्षा में जोड़ा जाए। केवल कोठारी कमीशन इत्यादि ने थोड़ी थोड़ी कभी कभी बात की कि नैतिक शिक्षा भी पढ़ाई जानी चाहिए स्कूल में। तो ये तो बात हुई और उन्हीं के मॉडल पर ये विश्वविद्यालय बने और उन विश्वविद्यालयों में, महाविद्यालयों में पाठ्यक्रमों का निर्माण किया गया और इनमें जोड़ा नहीं गया। जो लोग काम भी किए, इतिहास, पॉलिटिकल साइंस, सोशियोलॉजी, जो लोग काम किए वो भी इन भारतीय ग्रंथों को अच्छे परिप्रेक्ष्य में प्रस्तुत नहीं किए, क्योंकि उनकी इंडिया कहां से शुरू हो रही थी उनको पता नहीं था कि अपना भारत 1947 से शुरू करें, 11वीं शताब्दी से शुरू करें या महाभारत वैदिक पीरियड से शुरू करें। वो कंफ्यूज्ड है, आज भी कंफ्यूज्ड है कि भारत एक देश था कि नहीं था, कैसे उसकी कोई शिक्षा व्यवस्था थी कि नहीं थी। और ये अस्मिता की लड़ाई अभी भी चल रही है, क्योंकि हम सोच रहे हैं कि भारतीय ज्ञान परंपरा को पुनर्जीवित किया जाना चाहिए। ज्ञान को ही पुनर्जीवित हो, चाहे ईस्ट का ज्ञान हो चाहे वेस्ट का ज्ञान हो। तो हम लोग ये सोच रहे हैं कि और सभी डिसिप्लिन में तो हम कुछ नहीं कर सकते, केवल सोशल साइंसेज में जो गैप्स हैं, मान लीजिए आगे का एजुकेशन सिस्टम के लिए कमीशन बने और वो बात करें कि इंडियन नॉलेज सिस्टम को डाला जाए। आज जैसे पॉलिटिकल साइंस में यदि हम सोचे कि इंडियन नॉलेज सिस्टम को डालना है तो क्या डालें हम? महाभारत तो पाठ्यक्रम में लगा नहीं सकते, तो कुछ पाठ्यक्रम बनाना है। तो आज की गोष्ठी का उद्देश्य यही है कि क्या चीज सोशल साइंसेज के लिए, क्या चीज हमारे परंपरा में है जिसको पाठ्यक्रम के रूप में, लेख के रूप में, और क्योंकि फ्रेमवर्क बदल चुका है। अब सिटीजन की बात है, सिटीजन सिर्फ किसे कहा जाता है ये वेस्ट कह रहा है और धर्मशास्त्र भी बता रहा है। तो एक अच्छे ग्रंथ के रूप में तैयार हो जो जरूरत पड़ने पर तत्त विभागों में उसको पाठ्यक्रम के रूप में लगाया जा सके, ये हम सोचते हैं, ये हम लोगों का उद्देश्य है। धन्यवाद।
My original training was in Western philosophy. I have found that there is a great deal left to be done and a great deal to be undone. So it's the undoing of what has been done, and I think Maninder made a reference to, post 47, why did we lose the impetus that was clearly with us in trying to preserve and resuscitate the Indian tradition, at least by way of understanding. My main focus is not in trying to revive so much as understanding what was the tradition. Well, whatever the reasons are, and I think that part of any project should be interested in the reasons, that is in the historical background, and and there is certainly quite a few people who have now written on this whole notion of the colonial consciousness with which we still live. We live today, and we had examples of this in Mr. Malhotra's talk on how the whites, if the whites are saying something, then of course it's acceptable even if they are pronouncing on yoga and the Kundalini, etc., etc. So I think that is an obstacle that has to be overcome, and people who are well, should we say, qualified to look at these historical factors should indeed also be involved in a project of this kind. My own field, of course, being philosophy, I don't even know where to begin, except that we do philosophy in the English language even when we are talking about Indian thought. And I think that has been a cause, only one cause, because one can do, one can study a system of thought perhaps in another language, but one has to be perhaps over careful. There was talk just now about what is digestible and what is not. But a whole lot of Indian, in my view, the categories of classical Indian thought are indigestible in the English language. That's the main point. And therefore, how do we tackle it while we are still working in English? The easiest way to confront a situation like this is to fall into ready-made categories. I am, in my own way, an admirer of the very dynamic and powerful Western philosophical tradition. I mean, let us not denigrate what the rest of the world has done. They have a very dynamic tradition, and they have ready-made categories for anything that because of the history. We must always remember that we are talking, when we are talking about Indian thought, that somewhere it's not something that's been running parallel to the West. The West has continued to have its history and develop new categories. So anyway, I don't want to exceed my time right now. I really want to say that there is so much vocabulary available on the market, as it were, that the simplest thing to do is to fit our thought categories into these pigeonholes, because they are readily available. And that is what has tended to happen, and therefore we have lost out on what is distinctive, what is unique, and certainly what is different. And it seems to me that the project of retrieving I mean, if I use the word wisdom, then it sounds again chauvinist. That is not my approach even. But only what is the meaning of this tradition? What was the trip that they were on? Is something that has to be rediscovered and studied for its own sake.
Mohini ji said we should understand the history of how it happened. I would say the post-colonialists are a large part of the history of how it happened. Because the post-colonialists, while you will say they looked at the West, and I agree with you, they critiqued the West, they understood the...
No, I didn't say that.
Okay, but a lot of people, post-colonialists, not you. Post-colonialists will give themselves credit for doing it, but my problem with post-colonialists, and where I part company with them in a serious way, is that post-colonialists did not understand our own system, therefore they were critiquing the West in a Western system. They were using Marxism, subaltern theory, feminism, this one, that one, which are fine, which are wonderful, brilliant theories, they have a lot of value, I respect them. But what they are doing is critiquing the West in the West's own terms. So it is actually the West's self-critique. It is the West's self-critique, how a Westerner would critique the West, is what these guys have copied from reading various stuff. And they've come here and called it post-colonial because they can put in some Indian words in it and because they happen to be ethnically Indian. But there is really no originality because they are not questioning the basic paradigm. Yeah? Now, this basic paradigm of the West is under threat for good reason, is in a state of collapse and disarray. Westerners themselves recognize this. Westerners are some of my best readers and supporters. Some of the people who endorsed included. They say we are in a crisis of myth, this whole edifice of our, starting with Hegel and onwards, including postmodernism. I would say, and I have a section here on my critique of postmodernism, that postmodernism, while it deconstructs modernism, it does not have an alternative positive. It does not have ananda. It is nihilistic. And these postmodernists, when you meet them, they're very angry people. They look very angry, very tense. Have you noticed? They're very angry, very tense, they're like that. They're very angry kind of people. Because after the reconstruction, there is no positive selfhood left, which is a state of bliss, which is what the Buddhist deconstruction does. When you deconstruct the neti-neti, when you say not this, not that, you're deconstructing the false constructions of the mind, you are not ending up in gloom and doom, you're ending up in anand. So the postmodernists did not do that. They don't have that kind of a thing. So I wouldn't say that the answer to all of these problems is we now follow the postmodernists, because in the West they are now looking for postmodernism. So they themselves have realized the fallacy of doing this.
I'm Sunit Verma. I'm in the Department of Psychology in Delhi University. Back in 1984-85, when I joined BA Honours in Psychology in Delhi, I was a little uncomfortable during the second year when I started feeling that most of the models, or all the models, were developed in the West, and psychology projects itself defines itself as a science. And in the name of science, these models were developed in the West and then circulated around the world as universal models. And since I had lived in the West a bit before that, I could see that those ideas, those models made sense in the American context, but made little sense, many of them made little sense in the Indian context. The other thing that I experienced was that I came to psychology looking for certain answers, my own personal issues, and I didn't find answers to some of those important issues. But my wider reading, general reading, for example, Buddhism, I found very useful in my personal life. So I asked my teachers, how come that's not included? It seems to be dealing with psychological issues. And I was told that that's not psychology, number one. And then number two, it's not scientific. So it cannot be a part of psychology. Anyway, I didn't let go of that, and I continued reading here and there. And I was trying to understand why the state of affairs was as it was. And in my MA, we have a paper where we do a small thesis, and I wanted to do a comparative East-West kind of a thing. After great resistance from my supervisor, and I was on the verge of dropping the course, the MA program, with the help of another teacher, a well-wisher, I managed to complete that, and then I went on to do my PhD, trying to understand why the state of affairs were as they were or are. My PhD I did on the topic is the scientific paradigm in psychology, challenges and possibilities. Where I looked at the historically how psychology developed in the West, first in Western Europe, then in the US, and then how all those ideas came here, all in the name of science. And then I also discovered that the view of science that is adhered to in psychology is considered to be a very classical view, which like based on the paradigm of Newtonian physics, looking at cause and effect relationships. And there's been a lot of debate in this area, which is called philosophy of science, about the very nature of science, which psychologists, even in the West, were largely oblivious about. And with that understanding and with the support and encouragement of a senior colleague now, but my mentor, Professor Geshwar Mishra, who is also in the Department of Psychology, then gradually we were able to bring in, so we started with a paper called Philosophy of Psychology in Delhi University, and in 2002 March, it's almost 10 years, we had the first conference or rather seminar on Indian psychology. And interestingly, I invited 3 people at that time, those who I knew had something of great importance to share with Indians. All 3 were psychiatrists by training, so they have that scientific label on them. One was a white person from Europe, but settled in India for more than 3 decades. And it was very well received. And now, with subsequent divisions, we have 2 papers which entirely deal with Indian thought, and 3 other papers which have major components of Indian thought. And next week, we are having a seminar workshop where Rajiv Ji will be also speaking on 10 years or a decade of Indian psychology at Delhi University. But this is only a beginning, and we are still largely a minority in the department, and there's a lot of work to be done. And Rajiv Ji's book, of course, is a very good reference book for our students also, because it is clearly giving that background and the uniqueness of India. That's all. Thanks.
I'm Satish Shah. I teach political science at Jawaharlal Nehru College.
My name is K.T. Ravindran. I teach in the School of Planning and Architecture. I'm a friend of Shankar and the Department of Philosophy and St. Students. Thank you.
My name is Ardhendu. I am a student of MA Political Science, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I do share the concerns that have been shown by the teachers and the other people sitting on.
Yeah, and there are very different aspects of India that is being put out on the newspaper. My interest in Indian philosophy is primarily because one, it is easier to study Indian philosophy today than at any other point in history. I think it's much more convenient for me to have the resources. And 2, I think Indian philosophy is not, it's an everyday thing for a student like me. It's not something that I'm living without. And I think I'm very blessed to have professors who are helping me realize that there's a conflict in my everyday decision making, and that is why I would like to explore this discipline further.
My name is Arushi Vats. I'm also pursuing MA in Political Science from Jawaharlal Nehru University. I do not have any formal training in philosophy, and I wasn't aware much about the nuances of Indian philosophical systems. But even to an untrained eye like mine, I could see that there was a clear absence of certain systems of thought in our course contents. You could just see that in the first glance. Even still, a huge chunk of Islamic thought is not included in our syllabus. Indian philosophy, of course, is excluded. And it is interesting because we're studying political science, in which we study a lot of political philosophy, and you would think that irrespective of Kautilya and Arthashastra being such a popular name all around the globe, these things are still not formally included. So they would give you recognition that yes, we know Kautilya wrote this text, but you don't need to study it. Which is amazing, because if he did write such a text and he wrote it before a lot of other major texts came in political philosophy, why are we not studying it formally? Why are we not studying it in India? Forget about West not studying it, but why is it not being included in our course structure? So these are questions that interest me, and I'm hoping that by taking part in such discussions, I could get to know more about things that are happening. Thank you.
My name is Rityusha, and I'm a doctoral candidate at JNU in Center for Chinese Studies. I'm primarily interested in an exercise like this because of one reason, that when I study international relations, I come across a lot of intersectionality in thoughts. I don't see binaries of India and China. I see a lot of intersection and interjunctions where we have our own poly-psychological and poly-philosophical contexts which basically try to intermingle. So I don't see sinology and Indology as such, but I see a lot of common references of thoughts. As somebody mentioned Mandala theory, I don't know, but many of us might not be knowing, but there is a resonance of this sort in Chinese philosophical tradition as well. when you read Sun Tzu's work of Art of War, you come across something akin to Mandala theory. So I come across a lot of commonality, and that is my point of reference in understanding or interpreting any text or trying to analyze any world situation which is in contemporary times.
Myself, Shashank, presently I am pursuing PhD in Center for Political Studies, JNU. My topic is religion, culture and power, and how it's impacts everyday politics, where I am trying to understand that how mass tradition as a knowledge system reduced to the power system over a period of time. Anchoring this on my MPhil work, I try to understand that how the debate on science in India during the colonial period had shifted and moved towards something become the region of the state during the Nehruvian period, and again in the when the new science movement emerged in post 1980s, still it's working within the framework of Western knowledge system.
Today's, in fact, this brainstorming session which has been organized, some of us in political science have been engaging with this issue for the past several years. Not out of any, in search of any passion or fad. Take the mic closer. Yeah. But out of our discomfort with the larger discourse which we encounter in social science as well, particularly in political science, from where we come. For example, I'm a student of Indian politics, and I'm researching on a theme called political representation in Indian democracy. And the issues which I have to, encounter there puts me in a piquant situation. For example, I'm basically trying to find out that how this issue of representation has led to a number of problems, including the partition of the country. The two most celebrated icons from our nationalist politics, Gandhi and Ambedkar, kept on debating and fighting on this issue. And even after 60 years of independence, that issue remains inconclusive and unresolved. But still we find that discontentment which we find at the deeper level, both in society and politics, remain unresolved. And the categories which are normally used to understand and explain such problems are mostly alien to Indian situation. The categories which have been handed down to us by Western political theory. And on the other extreme, we have another problem. If we try to talk in terms of alternative, vocabulary, then what Dr. Sankaran was trying to hint at, I agree with him, will be either landing up, in a rightist brand of politics, using certain other categories which are totally unacceptable to the larger, the society and the people who ultimately matter in politics today. Or basically you will be failing in your project. You will not be able to understand or explain the problem or the challenges which you have basically set out to do. So such problems we encounter. I think, in fact, what Manindra was trying to say in the morning, that Indian political thought, that is another interesting, area for our engagement, because political science didn't have anything called Indian political thought, till recently. Only now it is becoming a very respectable, branch of political science in most of the universities in India, and not because of any, genuine quest for knowledge or engaging with the Indian, thinkers, but largely because the Western political scientists have all on a sudden got interested in Indian political, thought and the thinkers. So suddenly you find that, they are mushrooming now all over India, all universities, all political theorists who are engaging only with Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau have suddenly started working on, Aurobindo, Gandhi and everyone in India. So that is how, we try to, to engage with our own, thinkers, our thought process, and so on and so forth. Now, so far this university system and the curriculum is concerned, it is not that no experimentation was done. It was done. Not only in colonial period, during the freedom movement, but even after that. Freedom movement, of course, during non-cooperation movement, there was a very powerful experiment in Delhi itself, the Jamia Millia Islamia. Before that, you had the Shanti Niketan. In the post-independent period, you had a number of commissions and committees. I think someone referred here. But the most interesting experiment was made in 1970s, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I think all other universities were experimenting, in the realm of modernity, but it was post-modernity. Imagine post-modernity by 30 years. Because it got rid of philosophy as a branch of knowledge when it was established in 1970. There was no philosophy department in JNU at that time. And the only university in the entire world which didn't have philosophy as a separate branch of knowledge. So I think experimentations have been done. But, to no avail. And finally, today, I think there is hardly any possibility of any engagement with alternative discourse, because now an attempt is being made to bring Harvard on our doorstep by our education minister. So I think this possibility is not expected from the state system. So I think as part of the civil society actors, we intellectuals who are trying to talk in terms of alternative discourse in knowledge system, I think in respective areas of our engagement, I think this will come in the next session where we will get more opportunity to specify that how we are trying to to bring out that particular issue, this comfort zone in our own area of operation, and how we'll be able to contribute in that particular theme and area. That I think will be part of the next session. So I think for the time we have to stop.
My name is Pramod Pandey. I teach linguistics at Jawaharlal University. Sorry about that. My interest has been for a long time actually. Having been trained in Western linguistics, I feel extremely grateful to the exposure and the training. But somehow I feel also being a victim of tradition as an Indian, because what I find very difficult to accept as somebody who is in search of knowing things, is that there are limitations which are brought to me by Western tradition, which is very essentially very dichotomic and has a certain mode of reasoning, which I find to be permeating in all the modern disciplines. So as a linguist, I have to choose between two theories, let us say very formalist theory and communications theory. There was a time when I was a student, if I told somebody, doing formal linguistics, if I told someone that I was friends with a social linguist, or that I had a paper in social linguistics, I would be sort of looked upon very contemptuously. How could I do that? Because it's not possible for you to talk to each other. That was the tradition, the dichotomy, which I find all over, in all disciplines. In psychology, we talk about behaviorism and empiricism, rationalist, empiricism, political science. I think this has come mainly from the Western tradition of thinking, which divides reality into two and wants to argue for the supremacy of one over the other, and vice versa, on account of which there is unwanted things such as reversibles. So you start with the research area which was stopped for 40 years, and suddenly it was being done, work was being done in the 50s, but because there was a movement and fashion switched to something. So it's this kind of thing, and I have to struggle against this trend in teaching the subject, and I have to make my students realize that it's not just one Chomsky linguistics, there are other traditions, the Indian tradition itself, the European tradition, which you must have exposure to. So this habit of excluding what is less important, etc., which I think is not very close to the Indian tradition, where we look for multiplicity and richness and coordination rather than differentiation and separation amongst things. And so the project seems to me to be of extreme importance and significance in trying to bring out what I think is essentially there in the Indian tradition, and most Indians feel uncomfortable not having anything not being in close touch with this. And I think this has been there for a long time. For example, the Panchatantra tradition has been widely accepted all over the world, fable as a medium of education. Whatever was good, has been accepted in history. Even now it's being translated in different languages and communities. Even within India, I would like to suggest that in the name of the Indian tradition, we seem to have a rich tradition, but there seems to be something deeper, really significant, and there are all kinds of superficial things also have come up in the name of the Indian tradition. So you have the shloka as a mode, and you can produce a shloka and have all kinds of nonsense in it. That is, it can come from anybody at all. So one has to watch against what we call Indian and what is the best in the Indian tradition. For example, I think of the Indian mandala notion of hierarchy, which is almost suppressed and non-present. When we talk about hierarchy, we always think about the higher and the lower and give it a value. Whereas the mandala system of hierarchy, which is dominant all over in the yoga system, the chakras that you have no hierarchy. There's nothing superior or inferior, etc. So so the mandala system means which of the let us say stars is more important than the other. All are important. There is no hierarchy at all. Being somewhere up and down doesn't mean higher and lower, but you have to look for the integration. So one has to think about what is truly important and significant in this tradition, and how this needs to be brought out. I must say that within the Western tradition, there have been extremely sensitive approaches to this, such as those which have brought out Panchatantra and Sir William Jones and many others who have really shown us, given us an insight into our own tradition. But there is also this brute force perspective on the Indian tradition, where you want to see everything from the Western way, and whatever can be seen is seen and presented in that tradition, because it is dominant. So we are made to see that that is how it is. So it's that brute force tradition which one should be against. But the Indian, there is this sensitive and extremely insightful tradition which we value. So I think we should sort of make contact with that insightful tradition rather than the brute force tradition, and try to link what we think is truly deep and something very significant in our tradition that can be brought up. I think only those who are within the tradition can do this, because others will find it very difficult, as we noticed from the translations that are available of the Indian texts, which are highly unsatisfactory, because there seem to be translations into the English language, but nothing of the Indian spirit is found in them. Thank you.
I'm Akhlaq Ahmed, Center of Persian and Central Asian Studies. I agree partly with Mr. Shukla, Mr. Shankar, and many more. But I would just like to say one thing, that in between this whole discussion and debate of Indian knowledge system or Indian philosophical system, we do forget the whole 1000 period of medieval period. And that tradition is somewhere preserved in the Persian sources. And the discussion was, or the debate was continued in the whole period. And we see in the writings of Amir Khusro and many other philosophers of that period, from all communities, Pandit who wrote in Persian, and also it was a kind of conglomeration of different ideas and philosophies running from the Middle East to the Indian tradition, and particularly we see the group of Dara Shikoh and Muhibullah Allahabadi, this group, and all other people who were writing during that period and even later. But the problem comes with the British. They basically wrote the history and all kind of things, and they divided whole knowledge system and the languages in the name of religions, like Hindu period, Muslim period, Islamic architecture, Hindu music, and Islamic philosophy, these are all fictitious terms, I think, and knowledge system does not, or language does not have any religion or anything. So we had to see from that perspective also, and we should not ignore this whole continuous tradition which was continued from the ancient period to the modern.
I am Ravi. I am teaching political science at Jacobson College, Delhi University, and I am just following what others are saying regarding the knowledge system. But what my understanding is that whenever we are talking about knowledge system, either Western or Indian knowledge system, we have to understand how this knowledge system is creating three things, that is power structure, domination and resistance. Because resistance is very important, and people will learn the philosophy of resistance whether it is coming from the Western tradition or from the Eastern tradition. So we have to understand these things. Secondly, what my understanding about the both tradition is that we must have to understand there is a difference, that one Indian tradition may be located in terms of wisdom tradition, because there is a difference between wisdom and rationality. So that we have to, at one point of time, we have to negotiate that how we are going with this idea of rationality as well as wisdom, because rational tradition of philosophy that is coming from, you can say from Descartes to present, is creating some kind of contractual society which is based on idea of identity and idea of participation on the basis of your interest. So this is very, very important to know. But if you see the wisdom tradition, it is not talking about the particular individual interest for which we are fighting the society by acquiring the knowledge or by using knowledge for our fighting tool. Rather, it is talking about some kind of liberative aspect.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm R.P. Singh, Center for Philosophy, JNU. In fact, I share the anxiety expressed by Manan Thakur. And during my formation years over the last 37 years, this kind of, discomfort was there, but it was a bit quietly. Now it has become very loud for a couple of years, because we cannot resist it anymore. And things have also evolved gradually, both at the level of India and the global level also. I just put forward 2-3 points, and maybe later on in the later discussions I will elaborate those points. First thing is that there is a lot of really misconception, rather myth of Indian philosophy. That we also pointed out, certain myths regarding orthodox, heterodox system, regarding spiritualism. We have to unfold that myth. And to unfold that myth, we have to see the underlying normativity in it. That normativity has to be, exposed and put on a clear side. This is the first aspect. In the West also it happened. When Socrates was involved in some kind of a dialogue, then what he is trying to unfold is simply the Greek myths and trying to bring out the knowledge system embedded into it. So all the more it's important for us, because we can use the mind, but we have to look at the reason part of it. So that unfolding the myths of Indian philosophy, this is one aspect. And the other aspect of which, I've been in fact working for the last couple of years, is that whenever we have got certain knowledge systems at hand, it performs two functions. One, that it helps us to elevate yourself, know the world in a much better manner, comprehend it systematically, express it coherently. But the other factor is that the actors of knowledge use it purposely. They use it for breaking the other kinds of knowledge systems. She talked about the Islamic thinking or Orientalism, for instance. We find that there is a power game being played under the name of ideologies, knowledge systems, constructions or structures of certain systems. So we have to see, and it has always been there. There is nothing new about it. People have been doing this kind of a business, and there is nothing wrong in it, because this is how the things move. Because if power is an enabling attitude and creating some kind of restraint also, then you have to accept it as a reality. Sometimes it happens that knowledge itself becomes the power, and that way we find it very difficult to discriminate between the two. It's only when the resistance group comes up and shows a new light on it, then we have to look at it from a different perspective. So this dialectics of knowledge and power is to be something which is, which we have to unfold it very clearly, so that when the things come up before us as a finished product, we know what kind of purpose it has really, and how far it will go.
And I really share all the, I have gone through this book being different. And Western universalism, in fact you talked about the crisis within Western universalism. The crisis is eminent because from Plato to Rawls, all the theoreticians, they have some kind of normative foundations to elevate the discipline. But now they are questioning the normativeness of it, thinking of normativity within those theoretical frameworks. This could be a very interesting discourse. And inside India, the way we have done it, that you have the Purva Paksha, Khandan, and the Uttar Paksha. So sense of collectivity remains there. But the Western universalism gets fractured. It becomes half-hearted if the normativity is removed out of it. We have to see it very clearly. And in fact, the morning couple of issues which have come up from Mahendra and Rajiv also, they are all very interesting. And maybe in the course of our later discussion, we can develop it. As far as systematizing Indian philosophy is concerned, I think we have to get rid of this orthodox, heterodox tradition because it is not there. It's not Indian at all. We have to look at the prasthanas, and there also we find the cosmology, like Sankhya has cosmology, Yoga has psychology, Nyaya has cognition, Vaisesika has physics, Vedanta has reality, Purva Mimamsa has hermeneutics. We can organize it in this way that it becomes understandable and without any bias to anybody. And it can be, we have to know that this is a globalized world, and Google is always watching everything. You cannot escape. So we have to be communicative effectively. This is another aspect. In the West, in fact, we see that people move from myth to logos. Heraclitus, he started with that kind of philosophizing. That whatever with reason, logic, and understanding we can grasp, let us accept only that much. But for that, you have to have the criterion of that reason, logic, and understanding. Or from logos to dialogo in Plato and Socrates. Or from dialogue to dialectics. Or from dialectics to multilectics or polylectics. We have to see how complex things become when they gradually move ahead. And our attempt is, our job is now all the more very, significant. What India can really contribute is that the confluence aspect of it, that it incorporates all the contradictions and tries to sublate them in a coherent whole, because it already has started this kind of holistic picture, as Raji has pointed out. So this technique is something very unique with the Indian, in the style of philosophizing. And I would like to share one more thing, that after independence, already there was some kind of intellectual vacuum in the sense of being Indian mind. But in 1980, there was a project called Project of History of Indian Philosophy, Science and Culture, FISP. Professor D.B. Chattopadhyay is the general editor of it. And they have brought out substantive books written by Indians and from Indian perspective. But there are Western perspectives also, because you cannot ignore. There are concepts which just overlap. In philosophy, generally it happens that if you really become a philosopher, then you are no longer Indian or Western. Because then you have universalized the notion to such a level that it becomes really not any kind of parochial thinking. So we should take cognizance of the contribution of the FISP also. And that is very substantive. A lot of volumes have come up, around more than 80 volumes have come up.
I have an article in it.
Yeah. Most of Moni is having, I am also having it. There are many such things. And it's very substantive work. They also realize the same kind of meaning. In fact, I remember D.B. Chattopadhyay, when he met Mrs. Gandhi, he said that, look, if India can contribute anything to the West or to the world as such, it's only philosophy. In science, they are much ahead of it. So we have to look at this kind of intellectual legacy, but we have to systematize it very nicely. I think the wires which has been raised by Anand Thakur, we have to be very loud and clear about our apprehension, about our anxiety, within inside, and then referring it back to the outside world also.